Hi guys, as we move into our text analysis of the monkey's paw, it's important to know exactly what examples or evidence you should be looking for and how to actually analyze the text itself. So, with that being said, here's a short PowerPoint presentation on text analysis and what you would need to consider both for the monkey's paw, but also eventually for the Twilight Zone, the comedian episode. The first thing that you'll need to consider is the narrative viewpoint or voices of the text itself, as every text, whether novel or film, uses a narrative viewpoint. The narrative viewpoint may be represented through the main protagonist's perspective, minor character, or even antagonist, and in The Monkey's Paw, we know that this is represented by a third-person omniscient narrator who is watching over the whites and the events that unfold after their dinner with Sergeant Major Morris. In either case, it's important to consider the reasons why the author, W. Jacobs, chose to have this third-person narration and why that specific narrative viewpoint may influence you, the reader's perception and interpretation as to what they read on the page and then think about. When it comes to the questions that you would need to consider as you begin to analyze the text, you would want to think about what narrative viewpoint is used in the text, and if there's more than one, identify each narrative viewpoint. Thankfully, there is only one. However, as it is third person, consider why Jacobs has used a third person. It'll be slightly different for the Twilight Zone, the comedian episode. We then need to consider to what extent does the narrative voice or viewpoint overtly position the reader or viewer and what it wants them to focus on or consider as we experience what that narrator sees as opposed to a character's first-person perspective. Does it express an opinion of the author, or rather does it cause us to judge the characters and their actions and what we see in a different way because of how we are reading what the narrator thinks or feels, whether they're involved or not? We also want to think about how the narrative voices in the text influence your own understanding being presented, and the potential themes such as to be careful what you wish for, or greed, or redemption, as we'll be exploring in both texts later on. So consider that as you reread The Monkey's Paw. The next area of focus is setting, and a setting, whether it be macro, so the larger environment, or the micro, the smaller environment, is what we need to consider and where the characters live and how they react. So, for example, Monkey's Paw might be set in the White's household, humble, top and bottom floor house. However, where else is it set based on how they speak and what other information we're provided, whether they're poor or rich or living alone or isolated on a street. Likewise, in the Twilight Zone, we do know that Eddie's bar is a main setting, but we also know that Samir's apartment is a setting and the bigger context or macro, larger setting of the city itself. They can be sites of challenge or struggle or even reward characters and can be set in real or imagined worlds. I would say that both of our texts are set in real worlds, but they do have slight elements of exaggeration. They can draw on contemporary or historical periods, geographical, location, or culture. And this is something that we'll discuss more, but consider how the Twilight Zone, the comedian, is set in contemporary America. Meanwhile, The Monkey's Paw is set in 1902 at the turn of, the British Empire and, in Britain or London itself. So consider that. We'll look into that shortly throughout this video, but also just consider how the places and societies are represented, whether positively or negatively, based on what the author would write, or rather what the director might show. So begin to consider whether or not that influences whether we would want to live in that world, why not, and how these settings might actually, to an extent, be a character within themselves to suggest a theme or idea. I know for a fact that in The Monkey's Paw we have some lovely motifs dealing with windows and lights and shadow and darkness, so consider that. Regardless, the overall questions that we would be considering are: what are the key descriptions that draw the reader's attention to the setting and why? What does the author want us to focus on and when? What do the descriptions help to convey or suggest about the time period in which they are set? How does the setting influence the character's decisions or actions? How does the historical setting shape or affect the characters in these texts? That specifically relates to the time period in which they're set. We also want to consider what kind of society and culture is depicted in each text. So we know that there's some societal values that are explored in The Monkey's Paw, whether it be about the etiquette that Miss White must wait to be spoken to, or I guess welcoming a guest into their house. But something as simple as the £200 being of significance in that time period in the opportunity to pay off a mortgage. However, the idea of being mortgage-free is something that is still explored in many contemporary texts today. So we need to think about how something as simple as the setting and how it describes influences the characters' opportunities, and how they might even be threatened by them in their present society. Another element is narrative structure. So this is different from narrative viewpoints, such as first, second, or third person and omniscient. We're talking about the plot, essentially. And this refers to the way in which an author has chosen to present the plot and the deliberate sequencing of events to create rises and falls in the narrative tension. So where there is conflict and hopefully suspense, but also eventual resolution or, dare I say, mystery. All texts, whether written or visual, will have their key points in narrative structure, whether it be a complication, rising action, a climax that's then followed by a series that work towards a resolution. And it's your job to consider how the author might have actually used these or manipulated them to consider or to create a message from them. So we still need to consider their structure, whether they're linear or non-linear, so whether they follow a chronological order of events, or in some instances might use flashback, or actually be cyclical, whereby they finish where they started, and it might be a hero's journey. We need to consider the questions: does your text follow a chronological or non-linear structure? Is there anything unique about the structure that breaks the conventional mountain structure, which we'll see in the next slide? What is the effect of the structure? Think about how it might engage the reader or the viewer's interest and create tension and suspense, or raise and answer a question about the resolution or conflict. And one simple point out about The Monkey's Paw initially is that it's broken into 3 parts. There's 3 wishes, which adapts to the rule of 3, but also something as simple as to how the opening setting is later reflected in the final moments and ends on a somewhat ambiguous assumption that it was Herbert's zombie who goes away. However, that is once again another technique used by Jacobs to create suspense, as it is up or left up to the reader, whether it's coincidence or it is The Monkey's Paw. So having a look at the narrative structure, this shouldn't be new to anyone, but we do have the exposition, which establishes the people, place, time, and setting. We have a number of complications or rising action. So remember, a story, or rather a text, can have more than one problem, but eventually they all hopefully lead to one climax, which then has a falling action of events that follow through, along with an eventual resolution, knowing that a resolution doesn't mean that it's solved, but rather it has come to an end, or a understood ending. Another element is language and imagery, or rather the conventions of the text. So this refers to how a text may use what is available to them to create meaning in the reader or viewer. For instance, in a written text such as The Monkey's Paw, we are specifically looking at where key words are used from that time and place. So it's important to know that if there's a word that you probably don't understand, it's good to look it up to see how that is influenced by the time period. But regardless, there's the basic language features that you should all be well aware of, such as personification, onomatopoeia, powerful words, simile, metaphor, alliteration, repetition, and the sense words. While alternatively in a film, we may still consider them as through what the characters say in the dialogue, but more importantly, the film conventions that we've already learnt, such as cinematography, sound, lighting, symbolism and colour, editing, and even mise-en-scène. Regardless, we need to think about how these conventions are explicit. So what is shown is taken at its literal value or meaning, or implicit, also meaning what we need to dig deeper and understand. So what is the deeper meaning to what is said or shown, and how might it have symbolic references to the reader and viewer based on their understanding. As always, we would be considering some questions. So the basic ones are, how does a chosen text use their conventions to shape the reader's understanding of something as simple as the characters, setting, symbolism, plot, and theme? How are conventions that are based on historical, social, cultural going to be used? How does the tone and the style of the narrative voice, whether it be written or visual, be influenced by these language features? Something as simple as how the characters talk or how they behave. but also what are the overall effects on the reader or viewer. Now, just as a kind reminder, we've actually explored many of this or these ideas in previous assignments and hopefully years whereby you've explored or analysed the understanding of language features in, say, a class novel, but you will have these resources available as a reminder. But also, as of the last two assignments, we've looked at camera or cinematography and film techniques when we analysed Juno this semester, and hopefully in the previous years you've been able to develop your understanding. But once again, resources are available to you. Now, the biggest one that we need to consider are the characters and the authors, otherwise known as the context, as to how these texts have been shaped by either the director or the writer and their lives and experiences, as often authors use their characters' actions, thoughts, and even appearance to reflect key themes or ideas. Due to the time in which the text is created, the perspective of the characters can actually mimic the author's views or values, or actually be used to set out to challenge an overall value that exists in society. And rest assured, this video will go through some in deeper detail, but it'll actually be up to you to consider the differences between The Monkey's Paw, written in 1902, and The Twilight Zone, filmed and I guess authored in 2019, and how they use the different contexts of whether it be a struggling household of the whites or a struggling comedian who searches for fame, not necessarily fortune in terms of money, to explore elements of greed, redemption, and, as always, to be careful what you wish for. It's important to note that characters are products of their time, so as already discussed, we need to think about how what they think and value is reflective of the time in which the text is written, or, as I said, it might challenge them. So Margaret Atwood's famous novel, The Handmaid's Tale, which has actually been adapted into a Hulu series and also has a sequel, certainly was a commentary against the thoughts and values of the time period in which it was written, but also talking about the future fears and rightfully so concerns associated with the rights of women in this day and age. So, just to clarify, a text is any piece of writing or a visual, such as a video, printed, or even a website. Context is the background to something, so the circumstances surrounding something. So often when you tell a story, you might give context as to whether or not you were tired, or the time frame, or how young you were, to maybe suggest how naive. Regardless, this is something that you're going to have to consider to be able to draw comparison between the two texts. So once again, we're going to focus just on the three key areas of historical, social, and cultural. And honestly, you're not going to have to worry too much about them. There's certainly no exam, but if you get a sense of the differences between them, you'll be able to make reference or understand where they might appear in both texts. So historical context relates to the details that surround an occurrence. In more technical terms, it refers to the religious values of the time, the economy, and also the political conditions that existed during that time and place. So, as already discussed in The Monkey's Paw, set in 1902, we have to think about the British Empire. We also have to think about how that influences Sergeant Major Morris's travels, or subtle reference to returning from India, the sense or wish for travel in terms of, I guess, the social context of the whites wishing to be able to travel. Alternatively, if we think about the historical context of the Twilight Zone, we can think about it loosely based in the Trump era America, and we'll be looking at the social and cultural context of what that text is saying about social media, fame, fortune, defamation, but also, I guess, the cost of using social media. Regardless, historical context is about time, place, economics, and politics, and we can think about how they might vary based on when the text is written. A great example of this is if you were to read the quote, "Sally hid her hands behind her back and crossed her fingers before she answered." So think about that. It's an excerpt from a court document in Salem, Mass., which was the Salem witch trials in 1692. Without the context of actually knowing what that or when it was given during a court context, we would say that it just shows the innocent action of a young girl. However, with the religious historical context of the time, when it was at an all-time extreme, villagers were very much obsessed with the devil and the thought of people being possessed, and unfortunately, once again, sorry ladies, being witches and using witchcraft. At the time, if a young woman were to tell a lie, it was fodder for hysteria, so this madness or panic. And usually it associated with a violent reaction of, well, hanging them, burning them, pushing them off cliffs. And a reader would assume that poor Sally was a candidate for the gallows based on the hanging because of the report suggesting that her crossing her fingers suggests that she's lying and therefore is a witch. So poor Sally. Here's another one that's in reference to that. I like it because it's contemporary and it uses the visual medium of a comic, but it's that classic reference to the first shot showing if she dies, she's innocent. If she survives, she's a witch, and that's where they would drown. And a very unfortunate end or demise, or in the current movement, to the historical context of the Me Too movement, a lot of men, I guess, to an extent, saying if she seems okay, nothing happened. If she claims it was an assault, she's just seeking attention. And everyone can have their different values and thoughts about it, but once again, we're looking at it from a historical context. So using the same idea of a witch trial or being put on trial. Social context is a little bit lighter and probably more easily understood, and it relates to the culture, education, wealth, and power interests of that time or of the people creating the text. So we need to think about where both authors, or I guess author and director, were raised and what is currently happening in their life relating to these key areas. A nice example is if we were to jump back to Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. It was set in the same social context in the time in which she lived, which is very similar to both authors of Monkey's Paw, Jacobs because he lived in that era, but also the director of Twilight, The Twilight Zone. And if we think about it, Jane Eyre it was about a woman in which they were seen as a lesser sex. There was a great divide between the wealthy and lower class and the strict class boundaries that were enforced. So with that context, one might read Jane Eyre and go, oh, that's a story about a young orphan girl and her struggles. But with the context, we can see that it reflects Bronte, the author's views on the importance of social inclusion and the championing of the strength of women. So it's actually interesting to do a bit of a read up about both authors and consider how they might have been influenced to then write the story itself. Cultural context, and you'll see there's a little McDonald's or Ronald McDonald image being, presented there. Think about how it shows Ronald McDonald kind of being worshipped as a god, and, well, in cultural context, as noted in the very old documentary Now Super Size Me, a number of children know or recognize Ronald McDonald over, say, a religious figure such as Jesus Christ, and that's because of his cultural influence. So these are the traditions and values and beliefs that shape us culturally. So it's about, what we kind of explore beyond the historical, political, economic wealth. And this might relate to gender roles. It might relate to attitudes towards sex and marriage. It might relate to social status. So if we think about Nosedive, the episode from the Black Mirror anthology, what was that culturally commenting on about social status based on social media? Some texts might focus on job opportunities, immigration, authority figures, and, dare I say it, just basic stereotypes. Nice example of this is, say, someone who is real, such as Donald Trump, in a social, cultural example about building walls, is influenced, or rather to an extent mocked on mediums such as Saturday Night Live, which is, dare I say, the height of sketch comedy in the world. Alternatively, think about how a text that might explore climate change and save the environment and might actually comment on the current movements and what they say or the reactions to it would not have been written about or explored in 1902 because it wasn't a focus or a cultural shift. Something as simple as a text exploring the idea of being a vegan or vegetarian certainly wouldn't exist up until, dare I say, the late 1970s. Regardless, it's important to think about these because the values that the author wants to convey are expressed through these or influenced by them, often revealed through the characters' attitudes and responses and how they think and what they see and do. So it's important to think about whether or not they're following status quo or challenging it. And the nice little image here is of an elephant clearly being looked at different levels and tiers because as a whole, we might go, yep, that's an elephant. We know what an elephant is. But if we actually look at each part of the elephant, whether it be the historical, political, or cultural context, like a text, we can draw greater meaning from it. In terms of the questions overall that you need to consider, it's as simple as this. Try and find moments within the texts, whether it be Monkey's Paw or the Twilight Zone, where we can sense that there's something relevant to the character's actions, thoughts, feelings, and how they might relate to the time period. At a basic level in Year 11, even if you were to address something as simple as the Sergeant Major Morris and the mysticism around the foreign object and the whites' wish to travel, but also the social context of them wanting to pay off their mortgage, and also then the cultural and social context of Moore and Megan's being a corporation that aren't willing to take responsibility of the death of one of their workers, but through a bribery wanting to pay it off, you're going to be able to establish enough there. Likewise, in the Twilight Zone, the comedian, if you were to consider the current focus on comedians and such as Dave Chappelle, Louis C.K. or C.K. Lewis, and the idea of defamation, but also that great analogy of be careful what you wish for is now translated to be careful what you say, because it might come true or be damaging and impact your life. You're going to be able to address this, new idea of social, political, and historical context. That's where we're going to leave this video. You'll see that I've used a color code. It's not because I want you to feel sick inside from all the highlighted colors, but my hope is that as you go to analyze the monkey's paw, you might like to consider these colors as your standard or your focus in a Word document as you're given questions or prompts to consider and respond to. Thank you.